Camping had always been one of my favorite ways to get away from everything. The noise, the stress, the constant distractions of life. Out in the woods, with nothing but a tent, a fire, and the quiet sounds of nature, it was easier to breathe. My fiancée and I had been going on camping trips together for years, and over time we had built up a rhythm. Setting up camp, cooking, relaxing under the stars. We knew how to handle ourselves out there. Last summer, we planned a weekend trip to Arkansas, choosing a spot that wasn't too remote but still far enough from the main roads to feel isolated. The campground was spread out, with plenty of space between sites and thick woods separating them. It was the kind of place where you might hear someone in the distance but never see them, where the sounds of crackling fires and faint laughter disappeared into the trees before they ever reached your tent. We arrived in the late afternoon, setting up camp at a site near a small creek. It was perfect, flat ground, plenty of shade, and a good spot for our tent not too far from the fire pit. The air was warm but not unbearable, the humidity hanging low over the trees. The scent of pine and damp earth mixed with the smoke from other campsites, drifting through the air in lazy tendrils. By early evening, we had settled in. The fire was going, the grill was heating up, and we were starting to cook. I was flipping burgers while my fiancée poked at the fire, occasionally tossing in small sticks to keep the flame steady. The sun was sinking behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The sound of cicadas had started to rise, their constant drone filling the air. Then we heard it, a voice, distant but loud, cut through the background noise, sharp, urgent. A man's voice yelling. At first, I thought it was just someone goofing around, maybe a group of campers getting a little too rowdy after a few beers. But then I caught the words. Help! I froze, burger still in hand. My fiancé's head snapped up, eyes narrowing in the direction of the voice. Came again, closer this time. Without thinking, I dropped what I was doing and ran. The sound had come from a few campsites over, just beyond the trees. My feet pounded against the dirt as I weaved through the brush, the undergrowth scraping against my legs. The smell of smoke and charred food faded, replaced by something sharper, metallic. Then I saw him, a man, standing near a picnic table, swaying slightly. His clothes were soaked in something dark, pooling at his feet in the dirt. For a split second, my brain refused to process it. Then I saw his leg. Blood poured from his ankle in thick, pulsing waves, pooling around his foot and seeping into his sock. It wasn't just a cut. It was gushing, spraying onto the ground in bright red streaks. His face was pale, his eyes glassy. My fiancée was right behind me, skidding to a stop as we took in the scene. I forced myself to move. Training from a first aid course years ago kicked in, apply pressure, elevate, stop the bleeding. My fiancée grabbed a towel from the man's table, pressing it hard against the wound, wrapping it as tightly as possible. Blood soaked through immediately. I turned and sprinted back to our campsite, nearly tripping over tree roots, my lungs burning. I grabbed my phone from the table, swiping at the screen with shaking hands. No service. I cursed, spinning in place. There was no time to wait for an ambulance, no way to even call for one. I ran back to the man, who was now sitting on the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. My fiancée had managed to slow the bleeding, but it wasn't enough. His foot twitched slightly, barely responding. I knew there was a hospital about 20 miles away, down winding back roads. A long drive in normal circumstances. Too long now. I made the decision before I could think too hard about it. I grabbed his truck keys from the picnic table, helped him to his feet as best as I could. He was heavy, leaning against me, his weight almost too much. We half carried him to his truck, throwing open the passenger door. My fiancée climbed into the back seat, still holding pressure on his leg. I jumped behind the wheel, turned the key, and peeled out of the campsite, gravel kicking up behind us. The road was dark, winding, Nothing but my high beams cutting through the night. My hands gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. My heart was hammering, but I couldn't let myself think too hard about what was happening. The man groaned, his head tilting toward the window. His words were slurred, mumbled. Couldn't make them out. I pushed the truck faster. I wasn't good with blood. Never had been. Even small cuts made my stomach twist. But now there was no room for that. No time to think about the warmth soaking into the seat, the way it dripped onto the floor mats. My fiancé kept pressure on the wound, kept talking to him, though I barely registered the words. The road stretched on forever. The dashboard clock barely moved, each second stretching into an eternity. Then finally, lights. A dull glow in the distance. The hospital. I swerved into the parking lot, barely braking before throwing the truck into park. The moment the doors opened, the man slumped, his weight shifting. The floor mat beneath him was soaked, dark and sticky. The emergency room doors burst open as staff ran toward us. Hands pulled him from the truck, voices shouting orders, the world tilting sideways. I just stood there, my breath coming in sharp gasps, my hands slick on the steering wheel. Then, as the last of the staff rushed inside, the doors swinging closed behind them, I realized my legs were shaking. My stomach rolled, a wave of nausea hitting me hard. I barely made it to the bushes before I threw up. Minutes blurred together. My fiancé's hand found my back, grounding me. Eventually, we sat on the curb, waiting. The parking lot lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows. An hour passed, maybe more. Then someone came out, telling us he would be okay. 18 stitches. That was all it took to fix something that had almost killed him. If we hadn't been there, if we had waited for an ambulance, he would have bled out. We drove back to camp in silence. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across our tent. The grill was still open, the half-cooked burgers untouched. We tried to salvage the night, sitting by the embers, staring at the flames. It didn't feel the same. At 10:30 p.m., the sound of footsteps on gravel made us both tense. It was him, limping but alive. He looked at us, nodded. No words were needed. We had saved his life, and neither of us would ever forget it. I had been hiking alone for years, always careful, always prepared. I wasn't reckless. I didn't take unnecessary risks. But none of that mattered when I found myself stranded, miles from the nearest road with no clear way back. I had planned a 2-day trip through a national forest, a loop trail that climbed a ridge, offering a long stretch of exposed rock before descending back into dense pine forest. The route was well documented, moderate in difficulty, and heavily used in summer. But I had come in the early fall, just after the peak season, when the air was crisp and the crowds were gone. I parked at the trailhead before sunrise, checked my gear, and started up the path. The first few miles were easy, wide dirt trails, gradual incline, the sound of distant birds in the trees. I fell into my usual hiking rhythm, my boots pressing into damp soil, the weight of my pack settling comfortably on my shoulders. The trail climbed steadily, the trees thinning as I gained elevation. After about 4 hours, I reached the ridge, a long, narrow stretch of exposed rock, sloping gently upward. I took a break, sitting on a boulder, drinking from my water bottle. The wind was stronger up here, carrying the sharp scent of pine and cold stone. I looked ahead. The trail followed the ridge for another few miles before dropping into a valley, where I planned to camp for the night. I kept walking. The path was easy to follow at first, marked by small cairns, stacks of rocks left by other hikers. But as I moved further along the ridge, the markers became less frequent. I didn't think much of it at the time. The terrain was open with good visibility, and I could see where the trail should be leading. Then the wind shifted. A low, heavy gust swept across the ridge, colder than before. The sky had darkened, not storm clouds, but a dull, flat gray. I stopped, checking my map. The terrain didn't match what I expected. The ridge seemed narrower than it should have been, the drop-off steeper. I turned back the way I came, and nothing looked familiar. The cairns were gone. The boulders I had passed earlier weren't there. It was just open rock, sloping downward on both sides, with no clear path. My pulse picked up. I wasn't lost. Not yet. I had a compass. I had my map. I had daylight. I moved carefully, picking my way back toward where I thought I had come from. But the terrain kept shifting. Small ridges and dips that hadn't been there before. I checked my map again, trying to orient myself. If I kept heading west, I would eventually hit the tree line, and from there I could find the trail again. I walked for over an hour. The trees never came. The landscape stretched endlessly in front of me. Barren rock, empty ridges. My legs ached from the uneven ground. My throat was dry, despite my water. Then I saw something ahead. First, I thought it was another cairn, a small stack of stones, slightly off balance. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a cairn at all. It was a pile of bones, not animal bones. My stomach clenched. I knelt, staring at them. The bones were old, yellowed, weathered by wind and rain. Some had been cracked as if by pressure. They were arranged in a rough circle, like someone had placed them there deliberately. I stood up, my breath coming fast. I turned, and I saw more, scattered across the rock in irregular intervals, small piles of bones, some barely visible under thin layers of dirt.
A femur, a shattered skull, a ribcage collapsed inward.
I backed away, my pulse hammering. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just someone who had gotten lost. This was something else. I turned sharply and kept moving. The wind had died completely. The air felt thick, heavy. My own footsteps sounded wrong against the rock. Too loud, too sharp. I needed to get off this ridge. I kept my pace steady, forcing myself not to run. I moved downhill, hoping to find a slope that would lead me back to the trees. But the ground kept tilting in ways that didn't make sense. Angles that felt wrong, dips that should have been climbs. Then I saw the cave, a narrow opening, barely visible in the rock face, partially hidden by a ledge. I hesitated. Every part of me screamed not to go near it. But I needed shelter. I needed a place to stop, to think. I stepped inside. The air was colder, damp. The space wasn't deep, just a small hollow in the rock, barely tall enough for me to stand. But the walls were covered in scratches, deep, uneven gouges, overlapping each other in chaotic patterns. I stepped closer, running my fingers over them. They weren't random. They followed a pattern, a frantic repetition of shapes, tallies, hundreds of them carved deep into the stone. I stumbled back, my breath quickening. I turned to leave, and outside the cave, less than 50 feet away, something moved. It was low to the ground, barely more than a shadow against the rock. Crawling, moving with deliberate, jerky motions. I didn't stop to look. I ran. I scrambled down the ridge, slipping on loose stone, my pack throwing me off balance. My knees hit the ground hard, pain jolting up my legs. I pushed forward, breath burning in my chest. The landscape blurred, rocks, dips, uneven ground. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Then trees. The moment I saw them, I sprinted. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping against my arms. My boots slammed into soft dirt. I kept going, running until my lungs felt like they would split. Then I collapsed. I lay there, gasping, my body shaking. The forest was silent, normal. I pulled out my map, my compass. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold them. But I wasn't lost anymore. I could find my way back. I walked for hours, refusing to stop. By the time I reached my car, the sun was setting. I threw my pack inside, slammed the door, and started the engine. I didn't look back. I never reported what I found. I never told anyone about the bones, the scratches, the thing I saw, because I knew no one would believe me, and because I knew somewhere out there in the empty stretches of rock, in the places where the trail disappears, there are things you aren't supposed to find. And once you do, they don't let you go. It wasn't supposed to be anything special. A short hike in the woods just to clear my mind. I'd taken this route before, nothing more than a few hours walk through familiar trails. The kind of thing you do to unwind, not expecting anything to change. But tonight, things felt different. I'd left home around dusk, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The woods were still lit by the last rays of light, casting long shadows across the path ahead. The air was cool, with the faint scent of pine and wet earth. I had my backpack with a bottle of water, some snacks, and a flashlight just in case. I wasn't worried. I'd done this before and knew these woods like the back of my hand. I hadn't planned on staying too long, but as I walked, the beauty of the forest drew me in. The way the trees lined the path, their branches reaching out like a canopy, made it feel like I was walking in a secret world. The chirping of birds had died down, but there were still the occasional rustles in the underbrush, a rabbit or a squirrel, maybe a fox. It was peaceful, almost soothing. The sun set faster than I expected, and soon, the woods were plunged into a thick, inky darkness. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam of light cutting through the shadows, but even with the flashlight, the woods felt oppressive. The trees seemed taller now, and the sounds of the forest seemed to fade away. All I could hear was the crunch of my boots against the dirt and leaves, and my own breathing, steady but a little quicker than usual. I'd planned to reach the creek by nightfall. The sound of water would make for a perfect spot to sit and take a break, but by the time I arrived at the usual clearing near the stream, something felt off. The place seemed quieter than usual, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I took a step into the clearing, my flashlight casting long, strange shadows over the ground. I stopped and looked around. There was no wind, no sound, just the stillness. For a moment, I wondered if I'd missed something. The creek usually had a certain noise, the trickling of water over rocks, but it was eerily quiet. I glanced at the stream, and sure enough, there was no water. The creek was dry. It wasn't just low, it was completely barren. I walked over to the bank and knelt down to inspect it. The ground was cracked, the dirt parched. No water had flowed through here in days, maybe weeks. I couldn't understand it. There was no logical reason for a creek to dry up like this in the middle of summer. I rubbed the back of my neck, uneasy. This place had always been here, and it had always had water. I stood up, the flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. A rustle came from the trees behind me, just on the edge of the clearing. It wasn't a small noise, like a squirrel. It was deliberate, heavy, as if something larger had moved through the brush. I turned, shining the light in the direction of the noise, but the beam only revealed a few tangled branches and some low bushes. Nothing out of the ordinary. I stood still for a moment, listening. The rustling had stopped. I should have turned back. Something about the woods felt different tonight, and my instinct was screaming at me to leave. But instead, I told myself it was just my imagination. It had to be. There was nothing out here. I couldn't be the only one in these woods. People hiked here all the time. I moved deeper into the forest, following the narrow trail that would eventually lead back to the parking lot. But with every step, the air seemed to thicken. The trees seemed to lean in closer, and the path became less defined. It was as if the forest was swallowing me whole. I should have been able to find my way back by now, but the darkness made everything look unfamiliar. I checked my watch. It wasn't that late, but something was wrong. The woods felt too quiet, too still. My flashlight beam shook as I turned around, checking behind me. But there was nothing. No sounds of animals, no distant rustling, no wind. Just an oppressive silence. I walked faster now, my heart beginning to beat harder in my chest. The trees seemed to be growing closer together, the branches tangled in a way that made it feel like the path was narrowing. It was harder to see even with the flashlight. The beam of light flickered for a second, and when it came back on, the forest had changed. It wasn't the same. The trees seemed more twisted, their bark dark and rough, the branches gnarled like fingers reaching out to grab me. The path ahead was now barely visible. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. Something wasn't right. The woods had always been dark at night, but this wasn't just darkness. It was something more. I turned around, but there was no sign of the clearing, no sign of the creek. I was deep in the woods now, and the path I had been following had disappeared completely. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I realized that I had no idea where I was. My phone was in my backpack, but I hadn't thought to check it. Now, I didn't want to. I could feel it. The woods were alive in a way they hadn't been before. I tried to move forward, but the trees now seemed to block my way. The air felt thick and heavy, pressing in on me. I stepped off the path and into the brush, my boots crunching on the dry leaves, but the ground seemed to give way underneath me. I stumbled, my ankle twisting as I caught myself on a nearby tree. Pain shot up my leg, but I didn't have time to think about it. I had to get out. I pushed forward, my mind racing. I was lost, completely lost. The flashlight was the only thing that kept me from completely losing my bearings, but the beam was weak now, flickering with every step. I didn't know how much longer the batteries would last. Suddenly, I heard it again, a sound from behind me, the rustling, that same deliberate movement through the brush. This time, it was closer, too close. My heart hammered in my chest, and I spun around, shining the flashlight into the darkness. But there was nothing there, just trees, shadows. I froze. A shape moved in the distance just at the edge of the light. It was large, too large to be an animal. I blinked, trying to focus, but the shadows played tricks on my eyes. My throat tightened, and I tried to tell myself it was just the forest, just the wind, but something inside me screamed to run, and so I did. I bolted down the path, my legs aching, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, everything went black. I cursed under my breath, desperately tapping the side of the flashlight. It flickered back to life, and I saw it. The figure. It was moving through the trees, following me. It wasn't human. The shape was too tall, too long. Its movement wasn't natural. It glided between the trees, almost as if it was floating. My stomach churned with a wave of nausea. Couldn't breathe. My legs wouldn't move fast enough, and I could hear it gaining on me. I ran, faster than I ever thought possible, my pulse roaring in my ears. My foot caught on a root, and I went sprawling into the dirt. Pain shot through my body, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet and kept going, my only thought to put distance between myself and whatever was following me. It wasn't until I reached the edge of the woods that I stopped. I didn't know how far I had run, but I could see the dim outline of the road ahead. The forest seemed to recede behind me, as though I had crossed some invisible line. The figure was gone, but I could still feel it in the pit of my stomach. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I reached the car. And even then, I didn't feel safe. The woods had changed. The trees had closed in on me in a way that was unnatural. Whatever had followed me, whatever it was, I didn't want to know. I drove home, hands shaking on the wheel, and didn't say a word to anyone about what had happened. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't explain the twisted trees, the way the forest seemed alive, or the thing I had felt watching me. All I knew was that I would never go back into those woods. Not ever. I moved into the house at the end of summer, in that stretch of time when the days were still long, but the evenings had a hint of fall creeping in. It was a small rental, plain and unremarkable, sitting at the end of a quiet street. A single-story house with 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, and a backyard that was mostly dirt and weeds. Nothing special, but it was affordable, and that was all that mattered to me. The previous tenant had left in a hurry. I could tell by the way certain things had been left behind. An old broom in the closet, a single chair in the garage, a roll of toilet paper still on the holder in the bathroom. The landlord didn't say much about it, only that the last guy had moved out suddenly and stopped answering calls. It didn't seem like my problem. First, everything was normal. I spent my days working from home and my evenings watching TV or scrolling on my phone. The house was old, and it made the usual noises, wood shifting as it settled, pipes clicking in the walls. Nothing that bothered me. Then I started waking up feeling strange. It wasn't just being tired. It was an exhaustion that sank deep into my body, like I hadn't really slept at all. My muscles ached, my back felt stiff, and my head was foggy. Some mornings, I found small bruises on my arms and legs, like I had been pressing against something hard in my sleep. I figured it was just from tossing and turning. Then, one morning, I found the front door unlocked. I was sure I had locked it the night before. It was a habit, something I always did before bed. But there it was, unlatched. I checked the house, looking for signs that someone had been inside. Nothing was missing, nothing was out of place. I convinced myself I must have forgotten. The next night, I double-checked. I locked the door, tested the handle, even stood there for a few seconds just to make sure. The following morning, it was unlocked again. I started feeling uneasy. Then there were the noises. First, they were soft. A faint creak in the living room while I was in bed. The sound of something shifting in the kitchen when I was in the shower. I told myself it was just the house settling, but I started paying more attention. One night, I woke up to a sound coming from the hallway. A slow, deliberate creak. I stayed still, barely breathing, straining to listen. Nothing. In the morning, I found the hall closet door open. I knew I hadn't opened it. I pushed it shut and moved on with my day, trying not to think about it. But things kept happening. Small things. My keys weren't where I left them. The kitchen drawer was slightly open. The light in the bathroom was on when I knew I had turned it off. Little things that didn't seem big on their own, but together, they started to wear on me. Then I started waking up with my blankets pulled off. Some nights, I would wake up shivering, my comforter bunched at the foot of the bed. Other times, it was gone completely, lying in the hallway outside my room. I started locking my bedroom door. But one morning, I woke up and found it unlocked. I tried to tell myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe I was sleepwalking. Maybe I was so exhausted that I was forgetting things, moving things around without realizing it. Then I saw the attic hatch. It was in the hallway ceiling, just a small wooden panel with a pull-down cord. I hadn't thought about it much, hadn't even looked up at it since I moved in. But one day, I noticed it was slightly ajar, just a crack, enough to see darkness beyond it. I grabbed a chair and pushed it shut, making sure it was tight. The next day, it was open again. I felt sick. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every soft sound made my skin crawl. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen. Around 3 a.m., I heard it. A soft, steady noise. The sound of something moving above me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then silence. I lay there, heart hammering, until the sun came up. As soon as it was light, I grabbed my keys and left the house. I drove around for a while, trying to clear my head, but I couldn't shake the feeling in my gut. I needed to know. I went to a hardware store and bought a long metal pole, the kind used to change light bulbs on high ceilings. When I got home, I stood beneath the attic hatch, gripping the pole in both hands, and pushed. The hatch lifted easily. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. Nothing. I reached up, hooked the pole into the latch, and pulled. The hatch swung down, revealing a dark opening. I hesitated, then grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen. I aimed the beam into the attic. There wasn't much up there, just exposed beams, a thin layer of insulation, a few old boxes covered in dust. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then I saw the blankets. 3 of them laid out neatly in the corner. Next to them, an empty water bottle, a pile of food wrappers, and a small, worn-out shoe. I stood there, my mind struggling to catch up with what I was seeing. Someone had been living up there. Someone had been coming down at night. I backed away, my hands shaking. I left the house immediately and drove straight to a motel. I didn't go back until the landlord sent someone to check the attic. They found a small hole in the side of the house, just big enough for someone to squeeze through. The latch on the attic hatch had been loose. I moved out the next day. I never found out who had been up there. I didn't want to. There's something about hiking alone at night that makes the world feel different. The trails I walk during the day, the ones I know like the back of my hand, take on a different personality after dark. The trees seem taller, their shadows deeper. The sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the wind shifting through the branches, stand out more. Even the dirt beneath my boots feels softer, quieter. I've always preferred hiking at odd hours. It started as a way to clear my head, a way to escape the noise of town. The woods around here are vast, spreading out in all directions, cutting through neighborhoods and stretching far beyond the highways. Some of the trails are well maintained, others barely used. I like to push deep into the lesser-known areas, the ones where you can walk for miles without seeing another person. There's something peaceful about it. Walking in the dark, knowing that most of the world is asleep while you're out there with nothing but the sound of your own breath and the rustling trees. Some nights, I hike so late that I end up watching the sunrise from deep in the woods. It's a sight that never gets old. How the darkness slowly melts into soft blues and oranges. How the first light filters through the leaves. It makes the long hikes worth it. But one night, I found something that made me rethink my whole routine. It was past midnight when I set out, later than usual. The air was cool, the kind of early autumn chill that makes your breath fog up just slightly. I had a good flashlight with me, but I preferred not to use it unless I had to. My eyes had adjusted to the darkness, and the moon was bright enough to guide me. I took one of the lesser-used trails, the kind that isn't marked on any official map but exists because enough people have walked it over the years. The dirt path twisted through the trees, cutting across a dry creek bed before climbing a gentle hill. I had been walking for over an hour when I spotted something unusual through the trees. A dim glow, just barely visible between the branches. I wasn't expecting to see a fire this deep in the woods. Campfires weren't unheard of out here, but they were rare, especially this far off the main trails. Most people who camped in these woods stuck to the designated areas closer to town. This was different. It wasn't just a fire. It was low to the ground, flickering unevenly, like it was burning in something unusual. Curiosity got the best of me. I stepped off the trail and moved toward the light, careful with my footing. The last thing I wanted was to snap a branch underfoot and announce my presence before I knew what I was walking into. As I got closer, I started to make out shapes. Structures, small ones, huddled together in a rough circle. They weren't tents. They weren't even real shelters. They looked like makeshift huts, pieced together from whatever scraps someone could find. Metal sheets, tarps, bed sheets strung up on sticks. Some of them barely stood taller than my waist. Others looked big enough for a person to crawl into. It was a shantytown right in the middle of the woods. The fire sat in the center of it all, burning inside the hollowed-out frame of an old tire. The rubber had burned away, leaving just the metal skeleton, blackened and misshapen from the heat. The flames flickered weakly, casting just enough light to see by. But there was no one there. That was the part that didn't make sense. The fire was still burning, but the whole place was silent. I stood still, listening, not just to the woods, but to the camp itself. If people were here, they were staying unnervingly quiet. No voices, no movement inside the shelters. Nothing. I took a slow step closer, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. The structures weren't abandoned, not completely. There were things left behind. A pile of clothes next to one of the huts. A plastic grocery bag filled with canned food. An old radio with a cracked speaker. Someone had been living here. Recently. I should have turned back. I knew that even then. This wasn't my place. Whatever this was, whoever had built this, they clearly didn't want to be found. But something about the whole scene felt wrong. Why was the fire still burning? Why had they left it like that? I looked around, scanning the ground for footprints, for any sign of movement. The dirt near the fire was disturbed, but I couldn't tell how fresh the tracks were. They could have been made an hour ago. They could have been from earlier in the day. I took a few more steps, just enough to get a better look at the shelters. Up close, they looked even more fragile, held together with rope and duct tape. Some of them had pieces of furniture inside, old chairs, a small table with a broken leg, a foam mattress pad half covered with a sleeping bag. Still no people. That was when I felt it, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. It crept over me slow, like a chill working its way up my spine. I've spent enough time in the woods to trust my gut when it tells me something is wrong. And right then, it was screaming at me. I wasn't alone. The realization sent a fresh wave of adrenaline through my body. My breathing slowed, my ears straining for any sound, any shift in the air. But there was nothing. Whoever had been here hadn't just walked away from their camp. They were still here, watching me. I didn't move. Didn't turn my head. I just stood there, staring at the fire, listening. The woods were too quiet. No insects, no wind through the trees. Just silence. Then finally I heard it. A sound so faint I almost missed it. A footstep somewhere behind me. Not an animal. Not the sound of a branch falling or a leaf shifting. A footstep. Slow. Deliberate. And then another. I turned and left, not running, not panicking, just walking steady and controlled, back the way I had come. My body was tense, waiting for the sound of movement behind me, waiting for whoever was out there to step into view. But they never did. I walked until the firelight faded behind me, until the woods swallowed it completely. Then, and only then, did I pick up my pace. My heart was hammering, my senses on high alert. I kept expecting to hear footsteps rushing up behind me, to feel a hand grabbing my shoulder. But nothing came. By the time I reached the main trail, the sun was starting to rise. The first light of morning cut through the trees, chasing away the shadows. I didn't stop walking until I was out of the woods completely. I never went back to that part of the forest again. And I never hiked at night after that. I had been driving long enough to know when something didn't feel right. I was running a long-haul trip from Illinois down to Arizona, hauling a load of construction materials, mostly rebar and steel beams, heavy but secure. It was a trip I'd done before, mostly interstate, no major mountain passes or tricky back roads. Just a lot of straight, open highway and long stretches of nothing in between. It was late September, the weather still decent but starting to cool off, especially at night. I had planned to make it down to a truck stop outside Oklahoma City before shutting down for a few hours, but I was running ahead of schedule. The road had been clear, and traffic was light, so I figured I'd push a little farther before stopping. I had been on the road for close to 11 hours already, only stopping for fuel once. I wasn't exhausted yet, but I could feel the weight of the drive settling in. My back ached, My legs felt stiff, and my eyes burned from staring at the road for too long. The sun had set about an hour ago, and the stretch of I-40 I was on was quiet, just the occasional set of headlights in the distance, most of them other truckers running night shifts like me. The sky was clear, the stars bright, but out here, that only made the emptiness feel bigger. I kept the cab cool to stay alert, the low rumble of the engine the only sound besides the tires humming against the asphalt. Then I saw something up ahead. At first, it was just a glow, taillights in the distance, dim and barely moving. As I got closer, I could make out the shape of a vehicle on the side of the road. A pickup, dark-colored, pulled onto the shoulder at a slight angle. Nothing unusual about that. People pull over all the time. Maybe a breakdown, maybe a flat tire. I slowed slightly as I passed, just enough to check if there was someone outside needing help. There was no one, just the truck sitting there, idling, taillights glowing red in the dark. The driver's side door was open. I kept moving. Something about it didn't sit right. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see someone step out of the darkness, maybe waving for help, maybe just standing there watching. But there was nothing. After a few more miles, I let it go. It wasn't my problem. If they needed help, they could call for it. I had learned a long time ago not to get involved with roadside situations unless it was a real emergency. But then, about 20 minutes later, I saw another truck. Same make, same model, same dark color, same open driver's side door. This one was farther off the road, barely visible in the darkness. No hazards on, no signs of movement, just sitting there like the first one. I felt my grip tighten on the wheel. Something wasn't right. I kept my speed steady, forcing myself not to check my mirrors as I passed. My brain was trying to come up with a reasonable explanation, but nothing made sense. Two identical trucks, both abandoned in the middle of nowhere. I exhaled slowly, pushing the tension out of my shoulders. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just a weird coincidence. Then I saw a third one. This time it was parked in the median, facing the wrong way. And this time there was someone inside. I only caught a glimpse as I passed, but it was enough. A figure sitting in the driver's seat, barely illuminated by my headlights. Not moving, not looking at me, just sitting there still as a statue. I didn't slow down. I kept driving, my heart thudding in my chest. My breathing felt tight, my hands sweating against the wheel. I had seen some weird things out on the road, but nothing like this. My mind started running through the possibilities. Maybe it was some kind of police sting, though that didn't make sense. Maybe it was a setup, a bait trap for someone dumb enough to stop. Or maybe I shook my head. Didn't matter. I wasn't stopping. The miles passed, the road stretching ahead, dark and endless. I tried to focus, tried to let it go, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then I saw the headlights. In my mirrors, far behind me, just two pinpricks of light at first. But they were moving fast. Too fast. I kept my speed steady, watching as they gained on me. My stomach clenched as they got close enough for me to see. Pickup truck, dark-colored. I swallowed hard, keeping my hands firm on the wheel. My mind was racing now, running through my options. If they tried to run me off the road, I was heavy enough that they wouldn't win that fight. But if they had guns, I forced the thought down. Stay calm, stay smart. The truck pulled into the left lane, speeding up to match my pace. I didn't look over, didn't give them any reason to think I was rattled. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they cut their lights, vanished into the dark. My pulse pounded in my ears. I could still feel them there, somewhere, running beside me in the blackness. I kept going. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Nothing. Then ahead of me I saw it. Another pickup, parked across both lanes. I hit the brakes, my tires screaming against the pavement, my trailer groaning from the sudden force. I felt my rig shudder, but I kept control, easing onto the shoulder as I came to a full stop. My lights washed over the truck blocking the road. It was empty. The driver's door was open, and behind me, I heard the sound of tires on gravel. I didn't hesitate. I threw the truck into reverse, slamming the pedal down. My trailer swung slightly as I backed up, my heart racing. Then, just before I hit the ditch, I cut the wheel hard and gunned it. The truck roared forward, my trailer fishtailing slightly as I tore back onto the highway. In my mirrors, I saw movement. Figures spilling out from the darkness, scrambling toward the abandoned truck. I didn't stop to see who they were. I just kept driving. I made it to the next town in record time, pulling into a well-lit gas station, my hands still shaking as I shut off the engine. I sat there for a long time trying to process what had just happened. No cops, no reports, nothing on the news, just another quiet night in the middle of nowhere. But I knew better. I never took that route again. I had always preferred hiking alone. There was something about being out there, deep in the woods with no one around, that made me feel like I had stepped outside of the world for a while. I liked the silence, the feeling of being totally untethered from the rest of my life.
No sedulis, no conversations, no expectations.
Just me, the trail, and the sound of my own footsteps. That's how I ended up hiking a remote trail in Montana late one afternoon, pushing further into the wilderness than I probably should have. I had been on a road trip for a few weeks, moving through the northern states, camping out when I could, staying in cheap motels when I couldn't. I had spent most of my time on well-traveled trails, places where I could pass other hikers every so often and feel like I wasn't completely alone. But that morning, I had stopped at a small gas station on the edge of a town I barely remember the name of, and the guy behind the counter told me about a trail a few miles out. "No one really goes up that way," he had said. "Not because it's dangerous, just kind of out of the way." That was exactly what I wanted to hear. So I drove out there, found the unmarked dirt lot he had mentioned, and set off into the woods with my pack strapped tight to my shoulders. It was perfect at first. The trail was well maintained, but clearly not heavily used. The trees were thick, towering overhead, their branches swaying gently in the wind. I could hear birds, the distant rush of a stream somewhere off to the right. Felt like I had stepped into another world. I should have turned back before it got dark. I had planned to hike out about 4 miles, then loop back before the sun set. But the trail was beautiful, and I kept pushing forward, telling myself I would turn around just after the next bend, then just after the next clearing. Before I knew it, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, and I was farther from my car than I had meant to be. I wasn't worried yet. I had my flashlight, extra water, and a small knife clipped to my belt. I had hiked alone plenty of times before, even in low light. I knew what I was doing. At least I thought I did. I was about 2 miles from my car when I first noticed the silence. Not just quiet, the total suffocating absence of sound. The birds had stopped. The wind had died. Even the distant rush of the stream was gone. I stopped walking. The woods felt heavy, like they were pressing in around me. I held my breath, listening hard, trying to pick up anything. An insect buzzing, a branch creaking, my own heartbeat. Nothing. That was the first time I felt it. That slow, creeping awareness that something wasn't right. I turned my flashlight on, sweeping the beam across the trees. Everything looked the same as it had before. Just woods, just the trail, just me. But the silence lingered. I started walking again, a little faster now, my boots crunching against the dirt. It was the only sound in the world. And then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the forest came back to life. A bird chirped. A breeze rustled the leaves. The distant stream was there again, whispering through the trees. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Just my imagination, I told myself. Just my mind playing tricks on me. but I picked up my pace anyway. About a mile from my car, I saw the first footprint. It was right there in the dirt, just off the side of the trail. Deep, clear, recent. It wasn't mine. I stopped, shining my flashlight over it, my stomach twisting. It was a boot print, same as mine, but bigger, wider, and it was pointing perpendicular to the trail, as if someone had stepped out of the woods, paused, then stepped back in. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. Nothing. I kept walking. The second footprint was even fresher. This one was right in the middle of the trail. My throat went dry. I hadn't seen anyone else out here. No one had passed me. No one should have been this deep in the woods at this hour. I swept my flashlight along the ground, looking for more prints. There were none, just that single boot print pressed firm into the dirt. I took a step back, my body tense. My heart was beating too fast now. Then I heard it, the snap of a branch, somewhere off to my left. I swung my flashlight in that direction, my pulse hammering. The trees stood still, thick and unmoving. I waited, ears straining. Nothing. After a long moment, I forced myself to keep moving, my legs stiff, my breath tight in my chest. I was almost to the car. I just needed to get there. The last stretch of trail felt endless. I kept my flashlight low, sweeping the beam along the ground, watching for more footprints, for movement, for anything. The silence had returned, thick and absolute. Then, finally, I saw it, the dark shape of my car sitting in the dirt lot up ahead. Relief flooded me. I was almost there. And then, just as I stepped off the trail, I caught one last thing in the flashlight beam. Another boot print. This one was different. It was facing mine, like someone had been standing there, waiting, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look around. I walked straight to my car, yanked the door open, and got inside, locking the doors the second I was in. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, my headlights flooding the empty lot. Empty, but I didn't wait. I pulled out fast, my tires kicking up dust, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. I didn't breathe properly until I was miles away. I don't know what happened out there. I don't know who made those footprints. Maybe it was just another hiker, though that seems unlikely. No one parks at that trailhead. No one hikes out there. It's too isolated, too empty. I keep thinking about that last footprint, the one facing mine, like someone had been standing there, waiting, and I wonder how long had they been out there, and how close had they gotten without me knowing. I was alone in the woods, far from any road or town, deep in the thick of a national forest where the trees stood like ancient walls, their trunks rough and weathered. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of the underbrush, the chirping of unseen birds, and the quiet whistle of wind slipping through the canopy. I had planned this trip for weeks, 3 days alone, just me and the wilderness. I wanted to get away from everything. The noise of the city, the stress of work, the endless notifications on my phone. I didn't bring it with me.
No GPS, no Messages, no Distractions.
Just a paper map, a compass, and a tent strapped to my back. The first day was peaceful. I hiked through miles of forest, following a winding trail that twisted through valleys and over ridges. The trees here were tall and packed tight, their branches so thick that the sunlight barely reached the forest floor in some places. When I stopped for a break, I could hear nothing but the wind and the occasional distant snap of a branch. I set up camp in a clearing beside a slow-moving creek. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth stones, making a soft, trickling sound. It was the perfect spot, flat ground, a good view of the surrounding woods, and easy access to fresh water. I pitched my tent, gathered wood for a fire, and settled in for the night. As the sun dipped below the treetops, I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal from my pack. The flames crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the trees. The darkness in the woods beyond my little campsite was absolute. Without the fire, it would have been like staring into a void. I should have slept well that night, but I didn't. I woke up more than once to silence so deep it made my skin crawl. No wind, no insects, no distant sounds of animals moving through the brush. Just complete, suffocating silence. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel like something was out there, watching. The next morning, I pushed the unease aside. It was just my mind playing tricks on me, I told myself. I packed up my things and continued hiking deeper into the woods, away from the more traveled paths. I wanted to be completely alone out here. By midday, I reached a steep ridge that overlooked a dense valley. I climbed down carefully, my boots slipping slightly on the loose dirt. The air down here felt different, thicker, almost heavy. The trees grew taller, their branches twisted, their trunks covered in deep grooves. The undergrowth was dense, filled with ferns and tangled roots. As I moved through the valley, I saw something that made me stop. A tree with long, deep claw marks running down its bark. The cuts were fresh, the exposed wood still pale and raw. Some kind of animal, I figured. A bear, maybe. I moved on, keeping my eyes open for any sign of large predators. I had bear spray in my pack, but I knew that wouldn't help much if I startled something big. An hour later, I stumbled upon something stranger. A small pile of bones at the base of a tree. They were clean, white, picked dry. Too small for a deer, maybe a rabbit, but there were a lot of them, scattered, as if something had been feeding here. I kept moving. The day passed slowly. The deeper I went, the more I noticed little things that felt off. Trees with deep gouges in the bark. Patches of ground that looked like they had been dug up. Twisted branches that seemed to have been broken recently. By late afternoon, I decided to set up camp before it got dark. I found a small clearing, pitched my tent, and built a fire. As I was gathering wood, I noticed something in the dirt nearby, a footprint. It was large, bigger than my own boot print. But what unsettled me wasn't the size. It was the shape. The front half looked normal, but the back half dragged, as if whatever made it had been limping or dragging one leg. The fire felt like a weak barrier against the vast darkness beyond its reach. As I sat beside it, I kept my ears open, listening for anything unusual. The sounds of the forest had returned, chirping insects, the occasional rustle of leaves. But every so often, I thought I heard something else. A soft shuffling, just beyond the light of the fire. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I felt exhausted, but I forced myself to pack up and keep moving. I wasn't ready to turn back yet, but something in my gut told me I needed to be more careful. I moved faster that day, hiking hard, trying to push past the feeling that I was being followed. The deeper I went, the worse it got. More clawed trees, more scattered bones, more footprints, always with that dragging gait. By the time the sun began to dip, I knew I had made a mistake going this far. I should have turned back earlier. Now I was too deep into the woods, too far from my starting point. I set up camp in a small clearing, not bothering with a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. That night, I barely moved. I lay in my tent, listening. Every sound made my heart race. At some point, I heard it again, that dragging step moving through the brush. It was slow, deliberate, closer than before. I stayed still, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. For what felt like hours, there was nothing. Then, slowly, they moved away, fading into the distance. At first light, I packed up and started back the way I came, moving as quickly as I could. I didn't stop to rest, didn't stop to eat. I just walked. Sometime in the afternoon, I reached the creek where I had camped the first night. I felt a small sense of relief. I was getting closer to the edge of the forest. That relief didn't last. On the ground near the water, something was wrong. The rocks had been disturbed, the dirt churned up, and there, in the mud, was a single deep footprint. Large, dragging. I didn't stop. I walked until my legs burned, until my lungs ached, until I finally saw the edge of the woods ahead. The sight of my truck, parked where I had left it days before, nearly made me collapse with relief. I didn't look back as I threw my pack into the truck and started the engine. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on paved roads, surrounded by signs of civilization. I still don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. But I know one thing for certain. I'll never go that deep into the woods again. I'd been hiking alone for a week, the air thin and crisp as I trekked through the winding paths of the wilderness. My goal was simple: spend a few days lost in the quiet, away from the chaos of everyday life. I didn't mind the isolation. The only thing that bothered me was the constant reminder that the deeper you went into the forest, the less likely anyone would find you if something went wrong. But I liked it that way. The trail I was on wasn't part of any popular hiking circuit. It wasn't even really a trail in most places, just the remnants of an old logging path that hadn't been used in years. I knew the risks, but I felt confident I could handle it. The only thing I needed was a map, my backpack with essentials: water, food, a sleeping bag, a tent, and a sense of adventure. The quiet was better than any luxury I could imagine. The first day was easy, and by the time I set up camp in a small clearing, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. I had a view of the valley below, the mountains towering in the distance, their peaks dusted with snow. Everything was peaceful. There were no signs of other hikers, no chatter, no civilization. Just me, the wilderness, and the sounds of the forest. I started a small fire, though it wasn't really necessary in the mild temperature. The crackling wood was a comfort. I ate some trail mix, drank water, and watched as the shadows grew longer. By the time the fire was reduced to a small glowing heap of embers, the sky was dark, and a strange sense of unease settled over me. It wasn't the kind of feeling that would keep you awake, but just enough to make you aware of every noise. The snap of a twig in the distance, the occasional rustle of wind through the leaves. It didn't help that I was alone. When you're on your own in the woods, the sounds can start to play tricks on you. Every snap of a branch could be an animal, or it could be something else. I'd read somewhere that the woods could make people paranoid. Some of it, they said, was just being away from everything, and some of it was the natural soundscape of forests. Things like wind and the creaking of trees that your mind misinterprets when you're isolated. I didn't know what it was, but by the time I zipped myself into my tent, the quiet felt oppressive. The night was long, and I didn't sleep much. At some point, I woke to a noise outside my tent, a scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the ground. My heart skipped a beat. I held my breath, straining to listen. The noise came again, followed by a soft thud, like something had dropped onto the forest floor. I unzipped my tent just a crack and shone my flashlight around. Nothing. There was no sign of any animal, no movement. I hesitated, then let the flap fall back into place and tried to calm my racing thoughts. My mind played tricks in the dark, and I knew it. When morning came, I was still unsettled, but I forced myself to get up. The sounds of the night felt distant now, like they had never happened. The forest was silent again. Maybe the scraping had been an animal. Maybe I had imagined it. The second day of hiking was more challenging. The trail disappeared completely in some areas, leaving me to navigate by memory and the map. The forest was dense, thick with trees and the undergrowth that seemed to grab at your boots with every step. I had to crawl through some sections where the branches had grown over the path. The air was damp, and my breath came in puffs, visible against the chill. Around midday, I came across something strange, an old, rusted metal sign half buried in the dirt. I knelt down to inspect it, The sign was barely legible, but it looked like it had once been a trail marker. It was completely covered in moss and rust, like it had been here for decades. I tried to ignore it, but something about it unsettled me. No one had been out here in years, I thought. Yet there were signs, old trail markers, abandoned campsites, and now this sign, left in the middle of nowhere. It felt like a forgotten trail, but it wasn't entirely forgotten. I stood up and shook off the feeling. The trail was getting steeper, and I needed to focus. The afternoon sun was beginning to slip behind the trees, and I had a lot of ground to cover. The thought of another night alone in the woods was starting to press on my mind. By the time the sun was setting, I found a clearing near a stream to set up camp. It was a beautiful spot, the water flowing softly over smooth stones, a peaceful place to end the day. I set up my tent quickly, lit a fire, and settled in with a small meal. But again, that uneasy feeling started creeping back. The forest was quiet, but there was something wrong about the silence. The creek gurgled in the background, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. The shadows seemed deeper than before, the air heavier. Every rustle of leaves, every distant snap of a branch set my heart racing. I got into my tent early that night. The fire was dying down, and I zipped myself inside. The thin walls of the tent felt almost too thin. The wind picked up outside, whistling through the trees. But it wasn't the wind that made me freeze. It was the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or something else, moving through the underbrush. But the footsteps were too deliberate. They didn't sound like the random, shifting motion of a wild animal. They were slow, almost as if someone was walking in circles around my camp. I tried to ignore it, but my heart was pounding. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement. The footsteps continued, closer now. My throat felt tight. Was it a person? A hiker like me? Lost or searching for water? Or something else? I gripped my flashlight and waited, my breath shallow. The footsteps came again, closer now, just outside my tent. Then the scraping sound returned, the same one I had heard the night before. It was louder this time, like something or someone was dragging a heavy object across the ground. My pulse was thundering in my ears. I held perfectly still. I didn't dare move or make a sound. The scraping stopped. Then came the sound of something heavy being dropped onto the ground with a thud, just outside the tent. I could feel my whole body go cold. I stayed perfectly still, my eyes wide open in the dark. What was it? The sounds stopped. The night grew eerily silent. I didn't dare go out to check. I stayed inside, wrapped in my sleeping bag, listening to the night, my mind running wild with thoughts of what could be out there. Eventually, I fell into an uneasy sleep, too exhausted to stay awake any longer. The next morning, I was too afraid to leave my tent at first. I could see nothing unusual outside, but the entire day felt off. The campfire from the night before had been completely extinguished. The wind blew leaves across the ground, but nothing else moved. It was as though the entire forest had gone still, as though something or someone had taken control of the place. I packed up my camp quickly and left, my heart still pounding. As I walked through the woods, the unease never left me. There were no other signs of life, no animals, no other hikers, but something about the place had changed. The woods didn't feel empty. They felt haunted, as if every tree, every rock, every leaf was part of something bigger, something I wasn't meant to understand. I kept walking, the sound of my boots on the ground the only noise I could focus on. The trail stretched before me, dark and winding, but I didn't want to turn back. I needed to get out. I finally reached the main trail and saw the first sign of civilization, a worn-out sign marking the end of the forest. I was exhausted, but I couldn't stop walking. I didn't look back. The woods were behind me now, but I knew I wouldn't forget what I had felt there. I haven't gone back since, and I don't think I ever will. Something about that place isn't right. Something about the woods stays with you, even after you leave.